On behalf of PAFI, I'd like to invite you to this session. We have been witnessing some very insightful conversations since this afternoon for the revival of the economy and how the situation has given the opportunity to reimagine, reboot, and reform today. Now, art and literature are the soul of obviously affected. They reflect the maturity of the country, but the pandemic has, in many ways, disrupted the flow of creative thinking and art. Luckily, the technology has come to help and have been developed in the last 2 years to provide platform for exchange of ideas, thoughts, and artworks. How can businesses assist in building a healthy ecosystem for the creative economy to flourish? Let's see. What does the future hold for us for this creative economy? And I think I will not take too much time to provide some insights. We have a very esteemed panel. And let me welcome the panel with Sri Pavan Verma. He's an author, career diplomat, and former member of Rajya Sabha. Mr. Adrian Ellis, Director of AEA Consulting and Chair on Global Cultural District Network. Ms. Anjana Submani, Founder Director of Mango Tree Tours and Exhibition, and Ms. Rashmi Dhanwani, Founder and CEO of the. Also, welcome Mr. Sanjay Roy, Managing Director of Teamwork Films, who would be moderating. And if the backstage conversations was any indication, I think we are up for a very interesting conversation going forward. I think the bios for every panelist is there on the PAFI website. The format is conversational by design, so I would request the audience to send in their questions and comments in the Q&A box, which Sanjay should be able to then take forward for discussion. And we have back-to-back sessions, so let me not take any more time. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar, and thank you so much, Rajiv. We're absolutely delighted that PAFI thought it fit to provide a space or a platform for the creative economy and the cultural economy. This is a rare, especially in India. In the rest of the world, the creative economy is seen to be a part of free government policy. In the United Kingdom, for example, the creative economy contributes 18% to UK's GDP, and it continues to grow. Yes, it's all been impacted during the COVID lockdown period. Governments, mostly in Europe, really stepped up to the table. They provided very large financial support to the industry, understanding the need of the moment. Germany, for example, provided 3.1 billion euros of additional support. The UK totaled 2.9 billion pounds of additional support to the creative industries over this past 18 months. I mean, obviously in India, we don't necessarily have those kind of resources available. But unfortunately, what happened was not only were resources not made available, there was no policy change that could help artists and artisans to be able to understand the impact of COVID, but more importantly, what can we do looking into the future? We have with us some amazing speakers, and I'm going to ask Rashmi from Artex, who's done a fabulous survey, to give us an insight about the impact of COVID on this industry and tell us how she feels being impacted. Rashmi.
Sanjoy, thankfully we discussed this question, so I can see that your video is a bit glitchy, but I'm going to try and cover and give everybody a sense of how badly the culture sector has been impacted. And you will notice the fact that I'm using the word culture sector instead of creative economy for a very specific reason, because in India, we don't find the mention of the word or the title creative economy, either in academic investigations or very limited engagement with the term in policy frameworks. And while it doesn't dull the validity of what we are talking about creative economy as a term, I think it's important to sort of understand its etymology in order for us to rescope it for our realities. So given that there is very little context of what this sector is, it's seen largely as an informal sector simply because it's so diffused. While you have a Ministry of Culture, its role is arm's length funding. And while you also have culture as a mandate in 11 other central ministries, there is this heightened celebration of India's culture as soft power. So there are a lot of these contradictions that we're talking about while talking about the culture sector. It is exactly what we dealt with when we were trying to measure the impact of COVID-19 on this sector. So it was a study that was done as a collaboration between British Council, FICCI, and us at the Artex company. Right when the pandemic hit, within a month, we had come out with this survey. It was designed as a tracer survey, so we would have put out 3 different surveys over the course of a year to understand how the impact is also evolving over a certain period of time. So that was the overall idea. I'll just share with you some key statistics out of that. The impact on the creative sector, 16% of the creative sector was facing permanent closure when we brought out the second report in early Jan this year. 22% of the sector was forecast at that time to lose more than 75% of its annual income. And just there is 50% of about 10% of the sector lost 50% of its annual income. There was certain pressure points that people highlighted, the fact that there is a sort of inexplicable and of course deep impact on people who are on the margins, women. There is gender inequity, there is loss of opportunity for people who are from ecosystems that are not, in some sense, the primary ecosystems. So these are some of the concerns that were highlighted in the report. 26% of the respondents feared that they'll not be able to continue in the last 2 quarters of 2021. This was when we had put out the survey in October. We were looking at a bit of a death knell for several organizations. What we also saw was the migration of cultural professionals into other sectors, which is a deep loss for any sector when you have excellent producers, stage directors, set makers. What do they do? How do they let go of their skill and move into other areas of work just to be able to survive? So we were looking at a very direct loss in terms of how it affected businesses and professionals, but also at the same time, we were looking at the intangible loss, which will only show its face in subsequent months and years down the line. The other thing to also keep in mind is the kind of people who were deeply impacted. On the one end of the spectrum were freelancers, people who have no safety nets. There is very little policy looking at gig workers in the culture sector in India. Those were the ones that were deeply affected. So when we spliced the data again to see who is actually more affected than the others, this was one side. And on the other side, it was the larger cultural organizations. So organizations that had budgets of 50 lakhs and above, they were most affected because, again, for them, there was little subsidy coming from the government or any other ways in which they could have supported to continue to grow in some way. So they had to let go of staff. They couldn't pay electricity bills. There were lots of these other concerns that were raised. The communities that managed to survive was the MSME sector, the medium and small enterprises. So having said that, even they were affected, but its data allows us to understand where the impact has been and be able to rethink and reallocate our resources to serve those most affected at this point of time.
Rashmi, just hold it there. Pawan, Ambassador Verma, Rashmi talks about reallocating resources, but we know, and you know more intimately, that government seems to have zero regard for the contribution of what can be the sunshine sector in India. The creative economy, according to even the most modest estimates, provides employment and provides an income for over 100 million people in India, yet it's not seen to count. What is the problem within the government and the bureaucrat that they do not see this as a serious sector to be looked at in terms of policy?
Well, actually, it's a strange paradox, Sanjay. On the one hand, especially with the coming of this government, but generally as well, great tributes are paid to Indian culture and our ancient heritage, legacy, and tradition. And a recognition of the fact that we are indeed a civilizational power beyond being a modern national republic. So, on the one hand, we have the fulsome tribute to this great, diversified, long standing cultural heritage marked by antiquity, continuity, diversity, assimilation, and peaks of refinement. On the other hand, and that's the paradox, successive governments, including the current one, which probably excels the previous ones in paying tribute to our past culture, actually ignore culture when it comes to the necessary level of support and nurturing which this sector requires. Because one truth about the creative economy is that currently it is not, by and large, except for a few artists across the spectrum, self-sustaining. So it needs a holding hand. I will come to one other reason why this is the case just at the end of my intervention just now. So now if you look at what the government has done, including during the COVID period, the actual expenditure of Ministry of Culture in 2010-11 was 0.017% of the GDP, which for me, I believe, considering that we consider ourselves to be a civilizational entity as well, is abysmal. But the interesting thing is that 10 years later, in 2019-20, this already abysmally low figure goes down to 0.012% of the GDP. So we are seeing, therefore, a further withdrawal in absolute terms, taking inflation into account and even otherwise, of government support. Now, after COVID, and COVID hit the cultural and creative sector very badly because we have no social security net, we have no guarantee for assured income for artists. And in those days, there was not even an audience. But the allocation for the Ministry of Culture in 2021 was slashed by 461 crores comparison with the previous year, which is a 15% reduction. And this came about when there was already in 2020 a 30% mid-year downward revision of the cultural budget. Now I ask you, how can you expect culture, which needs a holding hand, especially in moments of great adversity such as the COVID pandemic, survive even at a minimal level when government is pulling back its funding? Even today, and this is what I'm worried about, I've been a cultural administrator. The Ministry of Culture does not have a comprehensive cultural policy. It does not even have a comprehensive cultural directory of artists. I think we need to ponder about these things because a scheme was launched in 2015 for making such a directory of artists. At least we should know who is where, in which sector, in what capacity, and what can be done for them, either by the state or by the center. The scheme was launched in 2015. It has been languishing. Do you know that only 1 crore has been spent out of the 43 crores that was initially
63,
allotted to
63, Ambassador Verma, 63 crores.
63 crores. So I stand corrected. But only 1 crore, to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, has actually been spent, which is basically an indication that projects are not taken seriously enough, and especially during this period. Now, if the government doesn't do it, can we look to the private sector? The unfortunate part is that corporate social responsibility spending has also consistently dropped for the cultural sector. And in 2016-17, it was about 300 crores plus. In 2019-20, 2 years later, it had dropped to 48 crores. You have another mechanism to get investments from the private sector, which is the National Culture Fund. And in particular, it is for participation in cultural preservation. That, as you all know, is languishing for the absence of adequate funding. So essentially, I'm saying that there is within our cultural sector a curious paradox of tribute but not enough support. One. Two, an inability to understand that there are but a handful of artists, you can count them on your 10 fingers, who are self sustaining in terms of the pricing and audience that they can demand. But the rest, we have a situation, amazingly enough, for a country whose arts go back to Bharat of Natyashastra 600 years before the birth of Christ, where prominent dancers cannot fill an auditorium even when ticketing is free. And I'll end here by making one point. Somewhere along the line, and we need to all ponder about this, we seem to have lost the balance between popular culture and classical culture, where you can find that for certain events in the area of popular culture, there are enough people who are willing to spend. But ironically, or unfortunately, or tragically, there is not enough money coming in for classical culture except for the few artists who can command a price and an audience. When I was posted, and this is my last point, as director of the Nehru Center in London, I used to be both surprised and taken aback to see, because I was comparing it with the conditions in my own country, that if there was a pop music performance, for instance, in Hyde Park, there would be thousands of people who would go. But at the same time, for a small performance of Western classical music in a salon in my neighborhood in Mayfair, where entry was pretty steep, £20 a ticket. Queues used to form from late afternoon to the evening to get a ticket. That is the kind of balance you need between popular culture and classical culture, which we seem to have lost, and which it is very important to go back to if we need the kind of support our creative industries need.
Totally, and we'll come back to the popular versus classical in a bit, because the world over, classical forms have to be supported by government because of the very fact that they are always at risk of being overtaken by popular culture. Anjana Somani, Pawan talked about this age-old heritage that we continue to doubt about. During the pandemic, we were able to, with an ally of the present government, raise a question at the Standing Committee of Parliament on Finance, where we brought in this thing about why isn't there support for artisans in this case, textile weavers. The answer that came back to the Standing Committee from the Department of the Ministry of Textile was, yes, it's difficult to provide the support. Why don't they instead take support by working in the MG Narega schemes? We pointed out that it takes 1,000,000 times of doing one task, which is weaving a thread or doing a particular pattern, to be able to build muscle memory, to have the finest muslin, the finest linen, the finest work. And if you are supposed to divert this then to building of roads, digging of wells, or other infrastructure projects, you're going to ruin the muscle memory of that artist and artisan, and necessarily completely destroy a whole generation of artisans in this case. This is not necessarily an argument that has been taken to heart by the government, but you've seen the devastation in the artisanal sector. Tell us a little bit about what that's been and how you see the possibility of kickstarting demand, because demand again has become one of the biggest issues today, not just in this sector, but in retail and in luxury in general. Anjana. Anjana, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Namaste. Good evening, everybody. Yes, Sanjay, you're absolutely right. We cannot afford to lose, our artisanal sector and their skills. So I think that we need to have a clear focus on, a vision on what the future holds for them. So the creative economies don't have to only survive, they need to thrive. And I think that we have to just keep on doing our thing and not really expecting much from, the government and people around us. I can just, when you're asking me the question, how do we kickstart our economy? I can think of 4 or 5 important points that we need to address. So, the good thing that was happened during the pandemic was that the artisans understood that they had to embrace technology and they saw the benefits of it. They made their catalogs, they learned how to do product photography and sell their goods through Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. So it wasn't at the other end of the spectrum. Technology was very much on the same side as theirs. So that is something they understood. And so that is something we need to embrace. And then, the buzzword in our field today is the IoT, the Internet of Things. And so these are certain things we can, talk about. So then what Mr. Verma was saying that we have the ancient culture we are all the time talking about. I think we need to have a design directory and a vocabulary of existing skills and what we are doing now, a new design idiom. After 200 years, what are they going to hark back upon? So I think that we have to, if we can provide artisanal skills that are, appealing to the contemporary world, it will be a great help. We should not be only thinking of something which is redundant today. And I also think that we need to focus on tourism. We have to support our artisanal sector in such a way that we don't lose them. We don't lose. We cannot suggest that they are going to break stones and do the Manrega. That is like quite ridiculous. But we have to also think that what can we do as individuals and what can the government do? So as far as I think the government doesn't understand properly, simply because we are not, our sector is divided into 14 ministries. We are spread over 14 ministries. And that is something which just doesn't work because they work in their own silos, don't understand the problem in totality. So that is something. So we are talking of something like a Karigar Mantralaya, which I think is something to that effect is required to address the needs in totality. And the second one is a census, what Mr. Verma was saying. In the last census, the number of artisans was 35 to 45 million people who were associated with craft. But this is when they are very skewed. These numbers are very skewed. Mapping like the Aadhaar card exercise, we need that very urgently in this sector because we have to know, and we have to know what percentage of artisans we are losing. That itself is, going to change their minds about giving them alternate income in Manrega, so to say. So these are some of the.
Anjana, let me ask you to just add to your thing. Pawan talked about CSR responsibilities, corporate responsibilities. You and your foundations and your family foundations have pretty much used their CSR resources to be able to help artists and artisans. Can you just spend a little time telling us why did you choose this as opposed to all the many other possibilities that exist? And therefore, what is the responsibility of other business houses also to do the same?
I think that it comes as a basket. People don't have to allocate all their funds into one direction, and they can do things which will benefit the community closely around them, the health, education, and all the regular things which are very necessary. But at the same time, I think that culture is something which is going to we need a continuity. We need to hand over something to the future generations. If they understand that, we are seeped in culture, it's a part of the very fabric of our lives. We don't realize it. But if the responsibility that we hold is to pass the baton and to have, how to put it, to inculcate a sensibility in the young people because they are going to be the torch bearers. So if we understand it, I think that every business house should allocate some amount in helping perpetuate culture, in helping the artisans. I think your initiative, Art Matters, is really quite a wonderful initiative. And more people should support such initiatives because it is important that we don't lose them. So when the first time when the pandemic hit, then the artisans with their, immense amount of self-respect did not want any food. They didn't want any money. They said, just help us sell our goods because we're getting food and monetary help through the government and NGOs. But the second time round, they were taught how to, sell, and they were helped out of the thing. They prepared for the next season, but the next season never came. And the second pandemic, the second round hit them. And this time hunger had to be addressed. And I sit on the advisory council of, one of the groups which was just formed organically. Huge groups came together, all with a common interest of serving the artisan. And it was so organic, we didn't expect such a thing to happen and such networking to happen. So there is a organization called Creative Dignity. They also have been recognized by the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum. And so I'm on the advisory board and they have done amazing work. So hunger was addressed, they've got credibility, and a lot of thinking is being done where they are thinking of, how this IoT can be implemented. So it is the Internet of Things is something
I'm
like,
going to come back to you on the creative dignity aspect because I think there's a lot of policy work going on there. Let me go to Adrian.
yes,
Adrian, this was what you've heard is the Indian scenario, the scenario where we are. What we would love to hear from you is how have other countries coped? One. Two, do you see the other countries now slowly emerging in this I won't say post pandemic, but post at least the vaccination drives and countries opening up? Do you see the creative industries in these other countries now being able to claw back to a near normal?
The world is a big place, and I think there is an enormous variation. But I think that I immediately recognize a lot of the description that Rashmi gave when she described the results of the work of ArtX, which is to say that there is the way in which COVID is a little like a tornado. You can have one house that is left standing, and next to it there's a house that's devastated, and it's difficult to believe the proximity of the two, because what COVID did in the cultural sector was to show many of the divisions within it. Larger institutions, larger cultural institutions of a traditional form have fared reasonably well. They have assets, they have reserves, they're part of the formal economy. Creative workers, on the other hand, many of the creative industries are micro businesses. They're in the informal economy. It's the gig economy. They fared very differently. They fared differently with respect both to their access to resources and with respect to their vulnerability. Things as you described at the beginning, Sanjoy, the digital divide, their access to digital resources, etc. So I think that although we talk about a creative economy and a creative sector, we need to understand that it is a sector with a lot of quite important and quite and under the circumstances of COVID, highly visible differences within it. And then the other dimension is the dimension of public policy, which is very different in many different countries. Two specific aspects. One is clearly public health policy, where public health policy has the difference between the global south and the distribution of vaccines, enormously important, and not short-term important in the medium and long term too. And of course, the level and nature of support for the cultural industries. But the big challenge about the level, even in those economies that have been extremely generous, we've got to remember that funding is a sort of stock and not a flow, if you like. And I know of many organizations that have actually fared COVID, peak COVID reasonably well because they have been privileged enough to have access to emergency resources, public funding, etc. But the long-term behavioral patterns, the long-term patterns of how people use access culture, etc., may last for years. What happens to international tourism, cultural tourism? What happens to when people are working from home rather than commute, have all those cultural anchors in city centers? How will they? So even in those countries that have had significant public sector support of their cultural infrastructure, I think the story is only, the story is not yet told of what the long-term impact on behavior, on funding, etc. will be. And of course, public sector and philanthropic priorities, I suspect, have shifted during this period. They've shifted in fairly fundamental ways. We haven't really touched on the climate crisis. One can imagine the preemption of both public sector funding and philanthropic funding for climate-related priorities. Again, the traditional cultural sector may, even where it has survived in a reasonably robust form, the eye of the storm, the tail of the storm, I think may still have a fairly profound impact.
Adrian, give us the argument of why every town, every city, every village needs a cultural district and how it contributes to the local economy. And if you can, with some facts in terms of the numbers, say Amsterdam, for example.
I am not the person to tell you every town should have a cultural district. I'm the person to tell you that there are reasons why culture clusters, Marshallian economics, just as there are reasons why other industries cluster, and that those clusters can be highly benign in their impact on local economy and creativity, on health, health and well-being, on building social capital, etc. And therefore, where they occur, they should be encouraged, and public policy can encourage them in various ways. What I don't think I would be an advocate of is saying, every town needs a big performing arts center or something like that. I think this is about marshalling resources and making explicit and making the soil conditions, if you like, for optimal creativity and a creative economy. So the argument that I would advocate is that the creative economy is strategically very important to many economies around the world, increasingly important. By 2030, the creative industries are probably about 10% of global GDP, and much of that creativity is fostered by the informal connections between closely located cultural activities and organizations. So, for evidence, where do you want to go? You can go to Brooklyn, you can go to Amsterdam, you can go to many cities around the world where you see those conditions, known as naturally occurring cultural districts. And I think that what many cities have done as they compete for inward investment, as they compete for knowledge workers, as they compete for tourists, as they compete for profile, if you like, has been to invest in culture as a way of attracting those attributes. The question is always, how intelligently do they do it? And that's where I think the sort of agenda of GCDN and others come in, because there's a default tendency to think of physical infrastructure as the pump primer. And as we have seen, there's been this enormous building boom around the world for the last 25 years or so, in Western Europe, in the States, in China, in the Middle East, increasingly in India, increasingly even in sub-Saharan Africa. And with the idea that investment in culture will bring the benefits that I described earlier. it's a little more challenging than that, because you need to invest in, if you like, the software as well as the hardware. There was that movie with the line "Build and they will come." Well, that line was never actually in the movie. What the movie said was "Build and he will come," I think. And so we've sort of built a myth in the cultural industries that investment in physical infrastructure is all it's mostly what it's about. It's a little more subtle than that. And if you were to ask me what the sorts of things are that I would be looking at in a recovery strategy for the creative industries, I think it would be around things like IP protection, incredibly important, because at the moment IP protection in many countries is weak, and therefore, with all the the anticipated, all the predictable asymmetries in effort and return, if you like, I think there's also an asymmetry of power between creators and the now enormous distributors of cultural content, who are really sort of vertically integrated monopolies. I think that I would look at the education system. I'd look at creativity and critical thinking and its place on the curriculum vis-a-vis technical education. I would look at protecting workers in the gig economy, and I would look at as suggested, I would also look at indices and quantification and building up data, so that things that are counted tend to matter more in people's minds than things that are qualitative, and therefore over time building up a deeper understanding of the importance of those elements, rather than the sort of sometimes quite basic infrastructure investment strategies that people have around culture. I don't know whether that helps at all.
Pavan, Adrian gives us the thing about investing in, or perhaps not investing in, big building and infrastructure. In India, we know that we think out of the box, and we think out of the box because of the kind of environment we are. We have to survive every day. Earlier, it used to be, how do I get my gas? How do I get my telephone connection? But it's also, we think out of the box because we have a perspective which culture gives us. Culture allows us to innovate. And again, we are at that cutting edge, or Indians can think beyond a particular thing because they have the possibility of perspective. And yet, the need to innovate as the future of Indian business, the need for design intervention across everything, from a simple phone to the WebEx that we are on, to a car, to a plane, to a process, for the environment in the future. All of this is creative thinking rooted in our cultural milieu. And yet, this is not seen to be essential. If you were to become, which I one day hope that you will become, the Minister of Arts and Culture here in this country, what would be your three important things to bring together education, economic activity, and culture to be able to make it a whole?
Well, that's a hypothetical question, and but I do have some views on what can be done. You see, I have a slightly different take on where culture is embedded in the structure of society, still making the transition between tradition and modernity. Culture was embedded, creative workers were embedded within the framework of societally delegated responsibilities. In a sense, society itself looked after its creative workers. If you recall, the temple in the village and overarching caste exclusions was the center in many ways of a diverse spectrum of cultural activities sustained by the contribution of the community. That umbilical cord has snapped somewhere as we move into the micro anonymities of a society in transition, from the traditional moorings to an uncertain modernity. We need to revive those again. In other words, put culture back within the structures of society, encourage the cooperatization of cultural activities so that there are scaffoldings of support inbuilt in the pursuit of those activities as a group. I would certainly make changes in the educational curriculum. As a renowned Indian who had a lot to do, Ramnivas Mirdha, I'm talking about, who was president of the Sangeet Natak Academy, once told me that, Pavan, I don't mind if the GDP falls by 1%. But I think it will be a tragedy for India if there are no more rustics left in this country, people who enjoy culture and are willing to support it. That aesthetic sensibility, somewhere that needs to be restored by a lot of other things, including greater knowledge, greater exposure, which is not, I feel, inadequate amount in our educational curriculum as it exists today. The third thing I would definitely do is to map out territory. Our information is scanty, and I suppose the task is daunting. Cultural workers are spread across this country in a very wide swathe, and it's difficult to map it, but an attempt has to be made, and that's why I refer to the directory of culture. So I would map out territories in order to be able to better assign scarce resources to areas where they would receive, or they would lead to optimal utilization and benefit. And lastly, I would greatly increase the incentives of the corporate investment into culture. The reason is that we have a system by which culture is endemically dependent on government for support. I've been Director General ICCR. I know how much activity in culture without government support just cannot happen. And I think that the support is disproportionate to the intrinsic talent in the cultural field. And it needs more independent pillars of support, including that from the corporate sector. But if the corporate sector has a choice to make between various areas of investment, very often, like with government, culture receives the short shrift, not high profiling. We need to give the greater incentive. We need to make them co-owners of the project. We need to give them the publicity for that contribution.
And the tax break.
So that, and the tax break, I said incentives. So there are a slew of things to be done, whether I become Minister of Culture or not.
Thank you. Rashmi, Durga Puja, the report that's just come out, 33,000 crores of contribution to Bengal's economy, the single biggest economic activity that Bengal has. And yet it's taken how many years for this first substantial report to prove that Durga Puja, which is both a socio-economic, religious activity that takes over not just Bengal, but many parts of India, and it spread its wings across the world, is still not recognized as one unit of a cultural economic activity providing support and income for locals in their particular place, be it village, town, street, corner, or wherever. Why?
Yes, Sanjay, but before I dive into that, I want to thank Mr. Verma for bringing up this point about the location of culture. How was culture located in societies? And the reason why I think it's really important to highlight that is because I'm obsessed with policy. And I wanted to sort of try and understand where was culture located in the mindscape. And, I found this entire discussion really fascinating. I'm drawing upon what Mr. Verma spoke and what Anjana spoke about was I can see the strain of support and patronage being this preeminent dialogue that we are having today about the creative economy and the culture sector. And I actually want to argue against that. Mainly because when you look at it from that lens, there'll be several other competing factors. You're talking about poverty, you're talking about education, and culture, I feel, has to compete in all of these elements. So while support and patronage are important, can there be an argument for a framework around enabling the culture sector, around empowering the culture sector, around skill building of the culture sector? And to me, those are very important aspects to talk about, because what is the culture sector? What is the creative economy? Along with handicrafts, performing arts, it's also design, architecture, music, theater, film, and there will be profitable parts of the creative economy, and there'll be parts of the creative economy that need to be supported. So this totality and this look into not just looking at the culture sector as artists and artisans, but also extending that to people who are supporting it as managers, as institutions, that totality needs to be looked at. To me, that is important. What are those boundaries and what is included in the creative economy? And from that, I'd like to sort of take to the Durga Puja report. So according to the Durga Puja report, which was done in collaboration with the West Bengal government, the tourism department, and led by, of course, the British Council, with I think IIT Kharagpur and Queen Mary University involved. According to the Durga Puja report, the size of the Durga Puja economy, or the value that it generates in the creative economy, is 32,377 crores, which turns out to be about 2.58% of the GDP of West Bengal, annual GDP of West Bengal. Now, for me, what's interesting is that what is included in this, right? About 860 crores comes from art and decoration, 280 crores comes from idol making, 205 crores comes from lighting and illumination. Literature and publishing, which is what we would normally consider as a part of the creative sector, accounts for only 270 crores. And food and beverage, F&B, accounts for 2,800 crores. So to me, this is what mapping does, right? Data does. It allows you to really understand what is going on in this sort of ambiguous space, what we think is culture. Where does this data come from? We don't have enough professionals who are looking at this information. The second example that I actually want to give in terms of contribution to local economies, and this is one of my most favorite parts of the report, is 35% of the questionnaire respondents earn 81 to 100% of their yearly income through the Durga Puja festival. So, and this is just a small example of how it affects the employment side of things. We actually did an impact analysis study on Serendipity Arts Festival. And we had a very small data set to look at because there was very little coordination between the tourism department and other departments to be able to get the data from. So this was just a small example. Serendipity Arts Festival, they employed about 2,900 professionals directly by the festival, either full-time on a project capacity basis in each year. They, the festival benefited many local businesses. About indirectly or directly contracted over 50 local businesses and spent about 21% of their total festival budget on Goa-based vendors. In addition to that, 59% of the overall festival budget was plowed back into the cultural economy, and 30% of the budget was spent directly on artists and creative professionals. It's important for us to look at this data and see how it goes back to the not just the local economy, but also the creative economy or the culture sector. Just some very interesting statistics. And sort of going back to this question of how do we look at revival? And I'm so glad that Adrian brought up this point of supporting the gig economy. I think we need to protect our people. It's one of the most vulnerable sectors. It's not represented anywhere. What is the intervention for support of gig workers? I remember in 2019, just before the pandemic, I was looking at the social security bill that had no mention of gig workers because we don't have a Zomato and Uber comparable in the creative sector to advocate for inclusion. And there was no way the sector could advocate for itself. So that continues to be a very, very deep challenge. What about employment and health insurance benefits? If we are looking at protecting our workers, this is in the light of COVID-19, this needs to be looked at urgently. I was in conversation with Shubha Mudgal recently, the musician and advocate herself. She asked me to look at some data that they collected of the number of artists who had died due to COVID-19. And we couldn't even begin to work on it. It was too depressing to even begin to get into the data. And just tipping my hat to, Anjana for bringing up this notion of how many artists have we lost. We don't know that. To COVID-19, there is no mapping of that. The second would be, how do we train the artists and the creative community we had, the creative professionals, to adapt their business models to shifting consumer habits? what Adrian was talking about, people are working from home more and more. There is a certain shift. So even if things go back to normal, whatever the normal means, the shift is going to remain for a long time. So how can we ready the creative sector to be able to respond to this change and train them? How can they implement and employ new digital tools? How can they employ with or comply with new health and safety requirements as it keeps evolving? Of course, mapping and measuring. Everybody's mentioned that, so I'm just sort of beating a sort of running horse. I would also speak about going local. I think one of the challenges that we've seen with the creative economy, and even with Mr. Verma mentioning the ICCR and the Ministry of Culture, these are central government bodies that are only going to be able to have a very limited understanding of what's happening across this mad country with so much going on, with such diversity. It's going to be impossible to expect one institution, one department to do all of that is, I think, a little bit impractical. So what can we do to support local, both as audience members as well as the culture sector? What can we do in our own little spaces to be able to support local libraries, local artisans, local initiatives, local studios? That is what I think would make a difference, and the government could incentivize that. And finally, just look at page 7 of the second report of Taking the Temperature, which gives us some excellent recommendations on what we could do to revive the economy, including creating deep networks within the creative sector so that we can create these frameworks and have the conversation with the powers that be, whether it's the government or the private sector. Unless we are able to empower ourselves with the information that we need, build those networks, and advocate for these changes, including emergency funds, it'll be very difficult to emerge out of this with more damage than we've already suffered.
Anjana, we're running out of time, so very quickly, two quick questions. One is that where do you see design playing a role now in the artisanal and craft sector, and how important do you think it is in terms of taking this to the next generational arts and crafts field? And how do you see the present education system, whether it's the NIDs or the design houses or the design shops, being able to play that role? That's one. And taking from what Rashmi said and what Ambassador Verma said, do we need an equivalent or a FICCI or a CII or a PAFI platform to bring together a creative industry people to be able to lobby governments, state departments, city halls to be able to get our word out? Anjana.
So to answer your second question, we've thought about it, that if we had an organization like a CII or a Wiki, but we felt that we were afraid to do that because somehow it sounds very top heavy for our sector, but we are dabbling with the idea and we're going to define ourselves very soon, what we want to do and how we want to come together. And before I answer your question on design, I would just like to respond to Rashmi because she brought out some very important points. So I just wanted to say, Rashmi, that craft is like self-sustainable, and it allows a part-time employment at one's own terms. And in semi-rural and rural areas, we don't see mass unemployment because it's not like a city in our cities or in foreign countries where they are dependent upon one entity for their employment. That is something quite unique because craft provides an alternate income, during times of flood and famine. And when we want to quantify the extent of the artisanal sector, we always talk of export figures. So when we're talking of figures, I thought I should mention this. The contribution of the handicraft sector to the local economy is much deeper than how much we export, because what the practices are associated with daily rituals, the utilitarian objects, the things we are wearing. There's timber, grain, flowers, weeds, grass, and so many things which are there in our local economy, which are required to make craft. But somehow local consumption is never taken into account. So, a vocal for local and has to be kind of, built into our psyche. And craft satisfies all the 17 markers of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's a huge soft power. So if we can have some kind of, I don't know how we are going to do the math of this, because that is really, I think, Rashmi, your strength. So, but this is something which we also understood as a corporate house when we were supporting. So now to answer your question on design, Sanjay, of course, design institutes, design plays a very important role in being able to connect. Earlier, the artisan knew his consumer. They created for them, they modeled it for them, and catered individually for them, so to say. But today, we have to cater to a larger market. Design plays an important role, but the artisan needs to have stewardship of his own tradition. We cannot relegate him to labor, that we have the design graduates in some fancy school telling him what he has to do. Actually, he has to gain that stewardship. It is his tradition. He has the design sensibility, he has the idea of what it is. It's not only a technique. Craft is not just a technique. So if we want to put, so there is a unique design school in Kutch, which Judy Frater is, she's a brilliant educator. It is her brainchild. So it is geared to the artisan. We cannot fit an artisan into a formal education sector. It has to be formulated specially for them. We cannot say that, okay, now they are design educated and they are designers. But when we talk of the NIDs and the NIFTs, yes, they are a link. So if we have and I think that the graduate can be from NID or NIFT, but they are not going to be able to create like the artisan. So we really have to understand that they are the real designers and not labor. This
And
perception.
we have to preserve and respect their year-old whatever. Pawan, Adrian, very quickly, 1 minute each, just closing, any closing thoughts that you have. Pawan?
No, I do feel that the pandemic has taught us one thing, one or rather three things. One is how vulnerable this community is. In spite of centuries, I'm talking of the creative community, in spite of millennia of skill acquisition, it's a very vulnerable community. So, can there be a combined effort of government and the corporate sector to strengthen support for it? Secondly, it's taught us that we need to not educate them, not become teachers when we don't have the qualifications ourselves, but can we marry art to better projection technology and markets? I think this is important because of the very vulnerability of this sector. And I have had an experience of artisans who were guided to better market their goods or to bring changes in their ultimate product without compromising their design sensibilities, which were better adapted to the market and therefore could bring possibly greater remuneration. This kind of dialogue needs to go on as a lesson from the pandemic.
Totally. Adrian?
There is one paradox at the center of our international predicament, which I don't have an answer to, but which I think is important, which is we are living in a golden age of creativity globally. We're also living in a golden age of access to culture. There is no recording so obscure. There is no artifact so unusual that you cannot find it online now, that you can't be listening to that recording within 20 minutes of it occurring to you. There's never in the history of humanity been a period like this. Yet at the same time, as per this discussion, we don't seem to have in place the business models and the ingenuity to support this this wonderful age in which we're living. So one way of looking at this is I think to focus on how it is that we can design with public policy, with voluntary action, and with all the ingenuity we can bring to bear, the continued support of what is, we shouldn't lose sight of, currently for us as people who enjoy culture, an absolutely extraordinary period in humanity.
Thank you, Pawan. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Anjana. And thank you, Rashmi. Rajiv, Bhaskar, back to you.
This has been an amazing session. The kind of numbers that have been thrown up is staggering for me. I believe my corporate friends were not even aware of the numbers that have come up on this report. I really hope PAFI will be able to take it up with their members and see how their members can look at various helping these cultural and artisans. They are a huge number. They are weavers, they are dancers, they're painters, they're singers, they're sculptors, they're puppeteers, they're all kinds of people. And if we do not save them or do not help them, do not conserve them, we run a kind of a risk that a couple of generations down the line, we might turn Philistines. And just for this, I will thank you for a lovely session, Anjana ji, Pavan Verma, Adrian, Rashmi. Thank you for your inputs. Special thanks to Sanjoy and Bhaskar. And for all the delegates who are online, please stay on for our next session, which is happening in a few moments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.